IVM.
Why is China investing in belts and roads, building infrastructure from the Balkans to Sri Lanka? Why is India building roads in Afghanistan or wants to build train lines connecting India's northeastern states with Myanmar or Thailand? Is this all because of grand geopolitical considerations, or is it mainly just economics that drives these ideas? Ambassador Shivshankar Menon talks to Pranay Kotasthane about connectivity on this episode of the Pragati Podcast. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. I am your host, Pawan Srinath. My colleague Pranay Kotasthane is the host of this episode. Pranay has been a frequent guest on the show and the occasional co-host, and has talked to us about everything from taxation to New World Orders. Pranay heads the Geostrategy program at the Takshashila Institution and writes and researches on a range of topics. Our guest today needs little introduction. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon is the former National Security Advisor to the Government of India and was Foreign Secretary, India's top diplomat before that. In his career as an IFS officer, he served as the ambassador to China and Israel and as High Commissioner to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. We'll be back with Pranay and Ambassador Menon after this short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We've been doing this for a couple of weeks, and I think it's working out quite well. If you're enjoying the show that you're listening to, why don't you do this? Pause the show, take a screenshot, and post it to your Instagram stories. Tag us on IVM Podcast, and leave us a comment for what you think about the show that you're listening to. We'll post that to our story so that, everybody can see what's going on, who's listening to what. Also, I have another little announcement. We are finally launching our new version of our Android app. It's going to be out officially and properly. It's going to move out of beta. So if you are listening to us on the old app, it might be time for you to kind of look for the new one. Unfortunately, it's not going to update from the old app. You're going to need to re-download the app or reinstall the app from the new listing. You'll be able to get the new app. You'll get a link for that from either the show description of the show that you're listening to, or you could go to our website and there'll be a link over there. So we launched a new show called How to Citizen. It is hosted by policy professional Meghnad S. and comedian Shreyas Manohar. Every episode is a look back at a chapter from a 8th standard civics textbook. The first episode featuring Rohan Joshi is out now. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus talks to author Amrita Mahale. She discusses her debut novel, Milk Teeth, and how growing up in the suburbs of Mumbai influenced her story. On Paisa Vaisa, P.V. Subramaniam, a financial trainer who runs the popular blog Subramani.com, discusses the math of retirement planning. On the Republic Day special of Pulyabazi, the hosts throw a light on the works of Dr. Ambedkar and discuss how caste has played a role in the history of India. On the second episode of Golgappa, Trupti is joined by actress Mansi Joshi. Mansi shares how working with some of the finest co-actors and directors helped her shape her acting talent. On our Kannada podcast, Thalle Harate, the discussion is about the power of the Kannada consumer and their rights to demand services in their own language. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back.
So today I have with me Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, and we are going to discuss on a topic that has been sort of going around in my mind for a long time about what role does connectivity play in international relations. So no better person to discuss this than Ambassador Menon. So Ambassador Menon, what in your opinion, at a macro level, what purpose does any connectivity project serve for the country which is trying to fund it or invest in this project in another country?
Well, I think the main advantage of connectivity projects is, of course, that it creates economic interdependence and, a rising tide raises all boats. And I think the advantages of trade in terms of helping economies to grow, I think that advantage is quite clear. I don't think we need to make that point. But the interesting part is that connectivity has had also political effects and geopolitical effects downstream, which I don't think all those who set up those connections or the linkages quite anticipated in all cases. I mean, in the past, in history, it was quite clear that when technology wasn't what it is today, when connectivity was actually so much poorer, then things like the railway, the telegraph, they actually made the British Empire possible. But they also enable the transmission of ideas and create a sense that we can actually change this reality. from what we have known, say, for generations before. And I think for me, that is the impressive part of what connectivity does. And you can see sort of those kinds of political effects in various places. You look at Southeast Asia, which in historically very connected to, at least in terms of technologies of the day, with India, with China, and especially maritime Southeast Asia. And then less so for a period because trade became localized in a sense. I mean, there was a South China Sea trade and there was a Bay of Bengal trade or an Indian Ocean trade, which was less. And then thanks to political divisions, Cold War, China became communist, war in Vietnam, war in Laos, throughout Indochina, through the 50s. You saw connections being built after those wars started winding down between Southeast Asian countries. And they became part of global value chains in the 70s, 80s. First, because of Japanese capital and Japanese investment in infrastructure, a lot of which was to economically integrate the region. And it was necessary as part of Japan's own growth. They might have done it for selfish reasons. But it also led to the rise of, well, the dragons first. And then all of them, each successive decade, you saw more and more countries being added to it. And a lot of that was due to the connectivity. And if it weren't for the connectivity and the nature of connectivity, which technology now makes possible, and if you couldn't communicate, for instance, you couldn't start doing things like building global value chains. Or if the connectivity didn't exist, if you couldn't move things cheaply, you wouldn't then have one Nike shoe made in 6 countries, finally assembled maybe in China and then sold in the US. I mean, this sort of value chain that is really a phenomenon of the 80s, 90s of globalization, this wouldn't have been possible without connectivity. And that connectivity, therefore, has political consequences as well. To some extent, the long peace in the region since the end of the wars in Indochina in the early 90s, when finally Cambodia and so on was settled. After that, a lot of it is thanks to the connectivity. Now, that doesn't mean that, if we connect, everything's going to be solved or that all our economies will do very well. It doesn't follow necessarily. The conditions have to exist and you have to also, the global economy has to help. But it's more than an economic thing. And that's my only point.
So that
ASEAN, which started as an anti-communist alliance, each of those 5 original members was threatened by a communist insurgency when they formed ASEAN in 1967 at the height of the Vietnam War. And the world was divided between communism and so-called free markets. At that time, it was started maybe in one way, but thanks to connectivity and so on, what it ended up was really a much broader association which contributed to welfare across the board.
Right. And what purpose does it serve for, let's say in this case, how did it help Japan from a political point of view, not just from an economic point of view? The reason why I ask that is, again, when we talk about China doing connectivity projects in Pakistan, for example, if we see the economic sense of it, I don't think it makes a very persuasive argument, even from Chinese point of view, right? But I'm sure there is the political angle, which is the primary driver of this connectivity.
Well, for Japan, of course, she's always been a sort of outlier in Asian politics, right from Meiji times. And she's always wanted a nation identity, whether it was Greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere or whatever. And immediately after the war, as early as 1956, Prime Minister Kishi was proposing to us and to the Southeast Asians some form of economic, not confederation, but at least some kind of discussion of economic integration and of how we could make our economies grow together by connecting them. And this has been consistent Japanese policy right through, partly because of limitations of resources and of their domestic market, and that they know that if they want to grow, they need to be connected to the rest of the world. By the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, it was also clear that labor and other costs in Japan were going through the roof. It would be cheaper to produce things elsewhere. And I think the natural logic of economics drove them out. But if you look at it, these are proposals which have come consistently, whether it was forming the ADB which was a Japanese idea, whether it's what Hatoyama suggested in the beginning of this century. The ideas, many of the ideas of, say, Asian financial inclusion, of structures to actually integrate an Asian investment bank, all these came from Japan through the 80s, 90s, in fact, right from the 50s onwards. The Japanese have been the greatest proponents of this sort of. In some ways, the Chinese now are beneficiaries of the hard work the Japanese did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yeah. And the Chinese angle from, let's say, what we were talking about, the CPEC or many of the BRI projects where the economic returns seem very,
well,
very...
the Chinese on CPEC, at least, to us, the Chinese make the point that they want to stabilize Pakistan. That they think if Pakistan keeps going down the economic drain, that frankly, extremist, radical politics will only get worse, and problems of terrorism coming out of Pakistan and so on will therefore become much more serious than they are already, which is bad enough. So they actually make the point that they think that their investment in Pakistan, if they can produce power, create an economy that's working, it'll create jobs, it'll stabilize society, and politics will also improve. I'm not sure I buy that. I don't think these are processes which, can be externally driven and which can be independent of history, of social structure, of the nature of the economy. These work when conditions are propitious. And I'm not so sure that those conditions actually exist in Pakistan. But that's another argument. That's a different...
So what do you think, for example, something like BRI, which on the Western front, let's talk about going towards the Central Asian countries and towards Pakistan, what can it achieve for China from a realistic angle?
See, from China's point of view, geopolitically, the first island chain represents a form of containment of China, which is basically either the US or her allies with military bases and countries with whom she doesn't have easy relations. She either has territorial maritime disputes, etc. So these are not countries that are... So as early as Jiang Zemin in 1991, 92, he was talking about look west. And that here was the raw materials, the markets, the linkages to markets, to Europe and to the West, which would all run through countries to their west. These were also countries... China became a net importer of energy in 1993. These were also countries with vast energy resources, most of the minerals known to man. So it made sense if China were to continue to grow at that pace, which at that time was 10%, no longer today. If they wanted to keep growing, that they needed to access these and that they would build the infrastructure and invest in the infrastructure. I think the BRI actually brought together a whole set of such policies.
Okay.
China's had like India, as a result of reform and change and opening, we've done very well. We've both grown phenomenally. We've never done as well in history as we both have in the last 30 years. But we've also increased our dependence on the outside world to a huge extent. More than half our GDP depends on external merchandise or services trade.
Yeah.
That is, that's a new phenomenon for us. We're not used to this. No, Chinese certainly not. In history, it's not a situation they're used to. It's kind of dependence on the world. For India as well, I'm not sure many of us realize how dependent we are on the world. But therefore, it becomes very important that you shape your external environment.
Right.
That environment be an enabling one, be helpful to your own purposes, to your own growth, to your own... And things like BRI are ways to shape that environment. So I think it's a logical result of the present stage of Chinese development, where they depend on the outside world for raw materials, for energy, for access to markets, for various things, including technology and so on. And so BRI is a physical manifestation of that, of trying to build those linkages and trying to create interdependence, which works for China.
So you still see that the primary logic is the economic function here?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because I don't think there's a line between economics and... geoeconomics, geopolitics. I think, frankly, you can't separate the two.
Yeah.
Many economic decisions are taken on political grounds and vice versa.
So basically, one thing is, for example, the Chinese saying that this will lead to a more stable Pakistan. That is an assumption, which is a big leap of faith that we don't know whether that's going to
It's a hope.
happen. Yeah, that's just a hope. So on these grounds, many times, given that now China has taken up so many connectivity projects, the arguments get made in India as well that we should also do these connectivity projects, and by us not doing something, we are actually ceding ground to the Chinese. So it is almost thought of in these terms, right? So for example, one of the projects that is always spoken about is INSTC, the North-South Corridor, and again it is spoken about that yes, this can be the project which can allow India again some presence in Central Asian markets, etc. But what are the economic grounds on these, right? Because will these be fruitful from that angle? And if there's no demand function, why should India get involved in these projects?
Well, it seems to me we should decide on which connectivity projects we do as India, depending on which works for India, on India's interest. Not because China is doing it, or we must do what China is doing, or because China has done something somewhere else and we must match them. I think that's absolutely the wrong way to go about this business. We are in the business of promoting India's interests. If it's in India's interest to be connected, which I think it is, and we're already connected, as I said, our growth depends on what happens in the rest of the world. So you might as well go out and work that. We have certain huge advantages. We have both physical and human connections and cultural and other affinities with our immediate neighborhood, which are really unmatched. Every border of ours can potentially be an open border for trade. After all, this has been one market, this Indian subcontinent, has been one market for large periods of history. You have transborder ethnicities who constitute linkage across all our borders. Each one of our borders has the same ethnicity on both sides, whether it's with Myanmar, with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Sri Lanka, with Pakistan as well. So these are things that you have a certain basis there for interconnection, for connectivity within the region, which makes a lot of sense and which you actually should be exploiting. And it makes economic sense as well. And it's been proved, I think, over the last decades that the more integrated we are in South Asia, the better we all do. These are the best decades for South Asia as well. Sri Lanka survived 23 years of civil war with only 1 year of negative growth. Why? Because the economies are connected through a free trade agreement that was done at the height of the civil war. So, and so on and so forth. I mean, same thing with Nepal, 12 years of civil war, etc. But when you go further afield, I think you have to actually establish the economic case. North-South Corridor, Chabahar, Zaranj, Delaram, access to Afghanistan, these are important. And there is an economic justification for every project that we've done so far. But I'm not sure that we've actually worked out all these things in the kind of detail, which is why many of them are very slow-moving. When you say, why haven't we actually built anything? Why haven't we done something? It's because people don't put money until they're absolutely sure. Certainly in our system. We don't put money until we're sure what the returns will be, what the internal rates of return of these projects are, and so on. And until we do that calculus, and I have not seen across-the-board calculations which makes it possible for you to connect, to compare, say, the North-South Corridor with something else you might be doing in BIMSTEC or BCIM, through Myanmar into China. What are the comparative economics, what kind of load, what kind of economic advantages it would bring to all the countries involved and so on. I haven't seen that kind of work yet. And I think there's scope for some of that.
So you just mentioned about BIMSTEC. So BIMSTEC does fall under this South Asia and Southeast Asian connectivity, which is critical to us, right? So from that angle, this is an important project for India.
Well, I mean, trilateral highway through Myanmar, which we, the Thais and the Myanmaris are supposed to do together, would be very, very useful. It would be transformative. Railway connections. There's 124 kilometers gap between our railway system and that which runs through Southeast Asia. Where the gap is in Myanmar. So it makes sense for us to do that. It makes a lot of sense, both economic and otherwise. Fact is that sea transport is still the cheapest. And exists. So that's been built up. That has actually improved considerably in the last few years between India and Southeast Asia. But I think there are multiple choices of what you could do. There have been proposals of a land bridge to Sri Lanka, for instance, which could help in reviving the economy of Jaffna and the other areas which were most hit during the civil war, the Tamil majority areas in the north of Sri Lanka. I mean, there's a whole set of proposals like that which I think are worth doing, including ports and so on around the Indian Ocean rim.
One more interesting thing was about connecting India's states in the northeast through Bangladesh, and I think that has already been some trials have been done
already. We do already. In fact, inland waterways. I think we are using Bangladeshi inland waterways to move shipments into our northeast, but also to connect into Bangladesh through the Arakan, through Akyab, Sitwe, and through Myanmar. I mean, there's multiple possibilities. I think the original driver has to be the economic calculation, but it can't just be, does it make money today when you build it? It has to be the larger calculus of what about its lifetime cost and what about its life cycle and what about the other benefits that it brings to the economies. And I think that's the way to look at these projects in the larger, as you said, in the macro sense, and that's a calculus that is worth making.
Yeah. So from an opportunity cost sense, now let's talk about the northeastern parts, and when we are talking about connectivity from the northeast onwards. Now, if there's a finite amount of resources available, right, and we've not been able to connect some of these places with the Indian cities like Kolkata, etc., the connectivity is still an issue there. So wouldn't it make sense for us to fix that first, intra-India connectivity, because that is less riskier rather than doing something which goes outside India? Just a hypothetical question.
I don't think it's an either or, first this, then that situation. You should do them all.
But with finite resources?
So that depends on the comparative advantage that you gain from the different projects available. And that I think should be, you can make an objective analysis of which one actually gives you the most.
Right.
And how quickly it gives it to you and so on. And then you make your calculus. I think that would be a rational way of proceeding.
That's true. Yeah.
Not necessarily the way we'll always proceed, but,
And what about connectivity towards the western part of India? Now, there are often arguments made that maybe India, because of the South Asian geography was one economic market, and after Pakistan emerges that we sort of get cut off. That's a common
Well, I think
sense,
SAARC was a common attempt by most of us, especially SAFTA and so on, and the talk of the South Asian Economic Community. I think that was an attempt by most of us to overcome the economic effects of partition. But I think so far Pakistan hasn't seen it that way. Pakistan's fear of being reintegrated into India, I think, is still stronger than the advantages she sees from connectivity. I mean, it varies. When General Musharraf was president, he talked of a South Asian electricity grid, or energy grid, actually. And he was willing to see much more. Since then, I think subsequent governments have not been, or the governments might have been, but the army was not, and so on. I mean, they have to still sort themselves out on these issues. So it's hard to see those happening very quickly. We have a whole set of proposals which involve Pakistan, including TAPI, which would bring energy from Turkmenistan, the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline for gas, for oil, connectivity to Afghanistan, Central Asia, land connectivity, which is what the old Grand Trunk Road all the way up to Khyber used to offer, the subcontinent. So there's a whole set of things that could be done once Pakistan overcomes her hesitation.
And India did some of these connectivity projects in Afghanistan also, right?
Connected
the link
to Iran.
Yeah, Zaranj, Delaram, the link to the Garland Road, etc. And China is also sort of now trying to do many projects in that region. So do you see any difference between how China does these projects and how India has approached it? For example, in the sense that China has brought in a lot of Chinese labor, Chinese products which are used in CPEC, right? Is there any difference?
Well, I'm sure there'll be a difference, not only in how we do projects. Chinese tend to use their own labor, their own capital, their own technology, their own standards, their own, they do it themselves entirely as a sort of black box turnkey operation. But also in the selection of projects, which ones are important to them, which are important to us. They'll choose what suits their interests. We will choose what suits our interests. These are not identical everywhere. So we will choose different projects. We'll do them differently. I take that as given. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. Ultimately, it's the recipient whose sovereignty is involved. So he gets to make the final choice between what is on offer and what he can get done. And most of them are quite happy to have infrastructure done by outsiders, and they'll negotiate for the best terms possible. I don't think we should start trying to think for the recipient.
Right.
We should actually be guided by what they want. Afghanistan's a good example. They should call the shots on which projects and where and what.
And often I see there are arguments made that, India's execution in all these has been very tardy. But I often think that we are underestimating the risks involved in this and the economic logic that we spoke about. So it's unfair to compare a project elsewhere and then say that why do we take 25 years or 30 years?
Frankly, I can point to every country has been tardy in doing some of these things. I mean, it doesn't matter which country you look at. But partly because, you're not in your own country. You're working in a strange place, strange rules, strange everything. So it's never going to be as smooth or easy as at home.
Yeah, I was looking up the Special Inspector General of the Afghanistan Regions report, which does all the audits, and they were saying how much US itself has been tardy in doing things in Afghanistan. They have not
China
been able to
and Pakistan.
dance.
I mean, between 2001 and 2011, China promised about $66 billion worth of aid to Pakistan and delivered about 6% of that.
Okay.
That's not, a lot of it is impression and image. But the fact is that there are objective problems about implementing something in Pakistan,
exactly.
as they've discovered.
Yeah. So coming to this point again, so do you think some of these connectivity projects, especially the black box kind of model that you were talking about, they lead to some reaction from the recipient countries or recipient stakeholders, right? So say nationalism coming against this and the idea that people from the outside are coming, not even employing us. So why should we be okay with this?
Yeah, I think there is some of that.
Yeah,
and that some of that is visible, I think.
But that can be managed, right? Depending on how the project is done.
Depends on the country. It depends on the country and what their tolerance is for this kind of thing. Whether they think they can get the project done anyway without that assistance, that really depends. It varies a lot, country to country. There are some countries who have no options, who would therefore go along.
There's a last question I wanted to ask. What do you think a connectivity project can't achieve? And where you would, let's say, and the dyad is similar, that there's a big, powerful country which has the resources, and on the recipient side, there are a bunch of countries which are smaller, but they are also on the path towards growth. Everyone wants growth. So what do you think these connectivity projects can't achieve?
It can't solve territorial disputes, can't solve political problems, unless the time is ripe and it's part of a broader political understanding and solution. They can't actually substitute. They're no silver bullet in that sense. What they are is a very useful tool and means when you are addressing problems like that, which can help to soften the edges of rivalry, contention, and political problems.
And they are better than, let's say, just financing, because financing is another part, right?
But money is fungible,
grants
right?
and loans. Yeah,
money is fungible, so you have no idea what it's going to be used for.
Absolutely. Money is fungible, but the connectivity involves you having people down there, etc.
Well, connectivity has several advantages in that it has multiplier effects. It creates habits of working together, of cooperation. It involves both of you building stakes in. So in that sense, connectivity is much better than just handing out aid.
Right.
And the record of aid is not very good anyway. So.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ambassador Menon. It was great talking to you on
Thank
this.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. Have any suggestions for what we should talk about on the show or who we should invite? over the next few months, do write into podcast@thinkpragati.com. If you listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, do leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. Get your daily dose of brain fodder at thinkpragati.com and get the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We are there everywhere.
Hello, everybody. We have a brand new daily podcast we're working on with Bloomberg Quint. All you need to know provides the top news on business, markets, and the economy so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Tune in every morning on BloombergQuint.com, the IVM Podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.